No phone, no watch, no clock on any wall. Now answer a simple question. What time is it right now? Most of us would be lost within an hour. We've outsourced the passage of time so completely to our devices that without them, we'd be reduced to guessing based on how hungry we are or how tired. And that makes it tempting to imagine ancient humans living in an even blurrier fog. Vague mornings, vague evenings, no real concept of an hour or a minute at all. That assumption is almost completely wrong. Long before anything resembling a mechanical clock existed, ancient civilizations built systems to slice the day into precise, repeatable, nameable units. Some of those systems were accurate enough that modern engineers, looking at the surviving devices, have been genuinely impressed by how well they solved a brutally difficult problem. How do you measure something invisible, moving, and completely unstoppable, using nothing but stone, water, and starlight? Let's start with the simplest tool, because it's also the oldest. A stick standing upright in the sun. Around 3500 BCE, ancient Egyptians were already using tall stone obelisks as a kind of giant sundial. As the sun moved across the sky, the obelisk's shadow swept across the ground beneath it, shortening toward noon and lengthening again toward evening. It wasn't precise enough to mark small units of time, but it was precise enough to do something remarkable. Split each day into a recognizable morning and afternoon, and mark the year's longest and shortest days, when the noon shadow reached its shortest or longest length. That's a solar calendar and a rough clock, built from nothing but a vertical rock and careful observation. But the real leap came around 1500 BCE, during the reign of Thutmose III. Egyptian engineers built a portable shadow clock, possibly the world's first portable timepiece, shaped like a simple L. In the morning, you'd orient the long stem east to west, and a raised crossbar at one end would cast a moving shadow across a series of marks scored into the stone, dividing the daylight into 10 equal parts, plus 2 additional twilight hours at the very edges of morning and evening. By noon, you'd simply spin the device around to keep tracking the shadow as the sun moved into the western sky. A functioning, adjustable, 12-part daily clock, built entirely from stone and the geometry of sunlight, over 3,000 years before the first mechanical clock would exist anywhere on Earth. So the Egyptians built one, and the tomb inscription of a court official named Amenemhet, dating to around the 16th century BCE, actually credits him personally as the inventor. His device, and its most famous surviving example, discovered at the Temple of Amun-Re at Karnak, and dated to the reign of Amenhotep III, worked on an elegantly simple principle. Take a stone or alabaster vessel, shaped like a cone, with sloping sides, and drill a tiny hole near the bottom. Fill it with water. As the water drains out at a nearly constant rate, its level drops past a series of 12 carved columns on the inside, each marked with 11 notches. One column for each month of the year, since the length of a night hour changes with the seasons. Look inside. Check which notch the water line has reached, and you'd know the hour, even in the pitch dark, even with the sky completely obscured by cloud. Engineers today still admire the design of the sloping walls. As the water level dropped, the shrinking surface area compensated for the dropping pressure, keeping the outflow rate almost perfectly steady, from a full vessel to a nearly empty one. That's genuine fluid dynamics engineering, worked out through trial and observation, roughly 34 centuries before anyone had a formal theory of hydraulics to explain why it worked. But a water clock only tells you an hour has passed if someone is indoors, awake, and actively watching it drain. For astronomers and priests who needed to read the sky itself, Egypt developed a different tool entirely. Around 600 BCE, called the Merkhet, essentially a plumb line sighting instrument. Used in pairs, 2 Merkhets could be aligned with the pole star, to establish a fixed north-south meridian line across the sky. Once that line was fixed, an observer could then watch for specific reference stars, known as deacons, crossing that same meridian overhead throughout the night. Because different deacon stars crossed the meridian at reliably staggered points as the night went on, tracking them in sequence. Let priests divide the entire night into 12 segments, almost as precisely as the water clock could, using nothing but string, a straight sight line, and patient attention to the stars. Combine those 12 night hours with the 12 daylight hours from the shadow clock, and you get the 24-hour day structure we still use without ever questioning where it came from. There was just one obvious problem left. Days and nights are one thing. Years are an entirely different, much harder problem. Egyptian timekeepers had genuinely solved the 24-hour day using nothing but stone, water, and starlight. And getting the year wrong wasn't a minor inconvenience either. It meant planting crops at the wrong time and potentially starving. Egypt's entire civilization depended on the Nile's annual flood, which deposited the rich black silt that made large-scale farming possible in the first place. Too early or too late, and the whole agricultural calendar collapses. So Egyptian astronomers fixed their attention on one specific star, Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, which they called Sopdet. For about 70 days each year, Sirius vanishes entirely, swallowed by the glare of the sun. Then, one particular morning, it reappears, rising just before dawn on the eastern horizon for the first time in over 2 months. Astronomers call this a heliacal rising, and Egyptian priests tracked it obsessively because it reliably arrived just before the Nile's flood began. They built an entire 365-day calendar around it, 12 months of 30 days, plus 5 extra festival days tacked on to the end, divided into 3 great seasons named for the flood itself: inundation, growth, and harvest. It was accurate enough that later civilizations, including the Romans, would eventually inherit and adapt its basic structure into the calendar you're still using today. And it wasn't only Egypt reading time in the stars and the sky. On a windswept plain in southern England, sometime around 2500 BCE, an enormous ring of standing stones was raised with a very specific piece of geometry embedded into its layout. Stand at the center of Stonehenge on the summer solstice, and the sunrise breaks directly over a single stone positioned outside the main circle, sending its first light straight down the monument's central axis. On the winter solstice, the alignment flips. The setting sun sinks precisely between 2 of the monument's largest stones. Whoever built Stonehenge didn't stumble onto this by accident. Achieving that kind of precision meant years, possibly generations, of patient observation of exactly where the sun rose and set across an entire year before a single one of those multi-ton stones, some weighing over 20 tons hauled from miles away, was ever moved into place. Some researchers now argue that the number and arrangement of stones may even encode a 365-day solar calendar directly into the architecture itself, effectively a working calendar you could stand inside of, made of nothing but rock and the sky above it. And this wasn't purely practical either. Cremated remains of roughly 150 people have been found buried at the site, suggesting the solstices weren't just agricultural markers, but moments to gather and remember the dead, timekeeping wrapped tightly around meaning, not just measurement. Put all of these systems side by side, and a pattern emerges that's easy to miss at first. None of them was trying to do everything. The shadow clock only worked in daylight, so a water clock was invented specifically to cover the night. The water clock only worked indoors, near a temple, so the stars were tracked separately. to solve the much bigger problem of the calendar year. And when a civilization needed a system durable enough to outlast any single water vessel or wooden gnomon, they built the answer directly into stone circles the size of a small hill, aligned with a precision that still lines up correctly thousands of years later, every solstice morning. Each tool solved exactly the piece of the problem the others couldn't. Together, they added up to something startlingly close to a complete clock and calendar system, built without a single gear, spring, or battery. We tend to think of no clocks as a primitive condition, something to feel sorry for. But maybe that gets it backwards. Ancient timekeepers didn't have the luxury of checking a screen, so they built a direct physical relationship with the sky, the water, and the stars instead, one precise enough to run an entire civilization's farming calendar for thousands of years without a single missed flood season. Today, we carry more timekeeping precision in our pocket than any Egyptian priest could have imagined, accurate to fractions of a second, synced automatically across the entire planet. And yet most of us couldn't tell you, without looking, whether the sun set 30 minutes ago or an hour ago, or which direction it rose from this morning. Consider what each of these systems actually required of the people who built and used them. A shadow clock demanded you understand your own latitude well enough to know how the sun's arc would shift with the seasons. A water clock demanded careful engineering, testing, and retesting the exact taper of a vessel until the outflow behaved the way you needed it to. Tracking deacon stars for the night hours demanded memorizing which stars rose in which order, every single night, for years, until the pattern became second nature. And predicting the Nile flood by watching for one specific star's reappearance after a 70-day absence demanded generations of continuous, uninterrupted observation, passed down and refined long before anyone wrote a word of it down. None of that was primitive. It was a different kind of literacy, reading a sky and a landscape most of us have simply stopped looking at. The instruments got extraordinarily better. The instinct to actually look up and read them got extraordinarily worse. Next time you're outside, as the light changes, try the oldest trick there is. Look at your shadow. Somewhere, a very long time ago, someone was doing exactly that, reading the exact same sun, using the exact same shadow, to build the first clock the world ever had.